interest of time, we might go ahead and jump in. How was the break? Everybody have a decent time? Healthy? Relatively? Good? Good? Welcome back. Welcome to the start of the spring Colloquium series here at the Ostrom Workshop. We're thrilled to kick things off with a distinguished speaker from SPIA, Professor Diane Henshel, who is an expert in risk assessment, both of environmental pollutants earlier in her career, and now in cybersecurity, which is fantastic. Talk about interdisciplinary, right? Which is wonderful. So, as you guys saw today, Professor Henshel is going to be talking to us about her new paper, Integrating Attackers and Defenders into Cybersecurity Risk Models. So, per usual, we'll have a kind of a quick 5-minute primer if there's anything you'd like to talk about in terms of particular issues of feedback or whatever you'd like us to focus on during our discussion. And then after that, I'll start the queue. So let me know if you have any questions, okay? So, Professor Henshel, please.
I have a short introductory piece just to help everybody understand what the issues are.
That'd be great. Yeah.
And in terms of feedback, any and all feedback, we're obviously right in the middle of writing the paper, and we could use feedback on the paper. Especially whatever is not clear, what needs to be elaborated on, how the flow is going, not going, etc. would be helpful. And in case you haven't looked at it, the Google Doc is the active process. So what was sent around last week has been clearly changed a lot since then. Okay, so this is one piece of a larger project. I am one of about 17 or 18, or maybe we're up to about 20 faculty members collaborating with, maybe a dozen people at Army Research Laboratory and the Cybersecurity Collaborative Research Alliance. We've had this, we're awarded the grant in, or the contract, I don't know what it is, in 2013, and this has been working since then. I'm the lead on the risk piece, and so overall the project involves integrating detection and risk in order to maximize the utility of any operation or task in a cybersecurity network or in a cyber network, and integrating agility or responses to minimize the risk and maximize the outcome. So when you're dealing with cyber networks are very complex. They have multiple layers, multiple pieces that feed up in different levels of organization, all of which together by itself is complex enough, but they're interacting dynamically in any network. That networks are never static, or it's a non-functional network. So networks are always changing. There's environmental factors, there's the internal active factors, there's how the different assets or components of the network are functioning, there's how they interact with other components, and that includes the processes of interaction, as well as the actual interface itself is a weakness within any network. So because networks are so difficult to assess at this point, some of the data, some of the metrics that you can get for networks are quantitative, and some of the metrics are more like semi-quantitative. So like high, medium, and low is a pretty typical way of looking at least the risk aspects of different networks. Because they're constantly changing, especially during a task or what the Army calls a mission. We have to be able to calculate risk dynamically. We have to be able to be adaptive and feed back to the agility responses, to the adaptive responses within the network. We want to be able to have our risk models be both predictive and quantitative enough that we can do a bright line comparison against this is safe, this is unsafe for a specific level of security. And one of the problems that's been around for the models that are out there, and one of the specific tasks that as an alliance we were asked to address, we were asked to bring in human factors into consideration of how networks work. And so therefore we had to integrate human factors, and as it turns out you have to integrate cultural factors as well, because cultural factors play a modifying role into calculations of network risk. So when you think about human factors, remember that humans actually have 3 different roles within all networks. We are users, and that's probably the biggest uncertainty and the biggest problem, because as users we both introduce risk, because if we don't use the network very effectively, or if we don't pay attention to risky issues, or just as I guess the most recent blurb that I was reading about this 15-year-old in Britain who used social engineering and phishing and a variety of other social engineering tools to access everything up to and including Obama's White House. So this is a 15-year-old who just, over time before he got arrested not too long ago. Thought that was kind of interesting. So that was in the news this weekend. But as users, you can also be risk mitigators by paying attention, by putting secure protections on your machine, by paying attention to what is and what is not a secure situation. That would be a great thing to keep talking about. Defenders are theoretically risk mitigators. Attackers are theoretically automatically risk inducers. They add to the risk of the network. Anybody who's an inside threat, whether it's a user or a defender, is also a risk inducer automatically. So these were our tasks. To carry this out, we had a simple, not so simple task. We started with just we have a top secret database, and we're trying to characterize the risk for the database under different conditions. And you start with the assumption that you have an incoming connection request. One of the pieces of information that you can get from the connection request is information about the country that it's theoretically coming from. Now, this is never a secure fact because, as anybody knows, well, anybody who pays attention to this knows, there's a whole lot of things called that you can fake what country you're coming from. You can pass the network information through another country to make it seem safer. Nonetheless, that is one of the few bits of information that you can rapidly get and make some quick assessments for. So not only do we have, and what we have here is two pieces of actual humans. So this was these pieces were all the regular parts of the network that we were modeling. And then we added an attacker skill indicator, and that's based on actual data coming in. So how the frequency of the attack, with the basic assumption that an attacker that is like a bot, very low skilled, so they're going to be attacking frequently. So we're talking about script kiddie type stuff, or throwing out of bots that are not being very effectively controlled by an intelligent person. So that's low skill. And then but you reduce the frequency of attack or penetration attempts till you get to the advanced persistent threat, who's somebody who's monitoring the network and doesn't make attempts other than in a kind of non-consistent, semi-random way, so that they are not being picked up by any detection algorithms, because if they start coming in predictively, then the detection algorithms will pick them up. And so this is kind of inverse to the frequency in which they're attacking. And then there's a defender indicator, and for that we just used the basic levels that are used at Army Research Laboratory. They have a low, medium, and high level defenders. So we just modeled those in. But then in addition, we were asked to address cultural issues. So for this one piece, we went to the country that the connection request is coming from and made some assumptions about the country, including the typical history of the kinds of attacks that are coming from that country, and then not just the number of attacks that come from that country, because when you do number of attacks, the United States stands out as like the top in the world in terms of number of bot attacks that come from the United States, and that's because we also have the largest per capita. We have the largest number of computers because we have a fair number per capita, because we're a fairly wealthy country and we are very, very well, I guess computers are well infiltrated into our countries, I guess. So you have to correct actually the number of malicious attempts that come out to a per capita or to a per computer basis. And so that data's out there. And then in addition, there's this question of whether or not the attackers in that country are known to be supported by different levels. So in the United States, attackers tend to be individual. There's a few maybe attackers where the people get together, and then there's things like anonymous where people get together Anonymous is kind of international, but nonetheless where people get together in a kind of loose way to attack who they choose to attack. They're doing it from a social justice perspective, but in general, it's a fair thing to say that the government, until recently, has not had a good coordinated cyber attacking unit. Now we do have very much a coordinated cyber attacking unit in the military, and they are obviously not focused on our country, they're focused outwards. But compared to us, you have things like Russia, where even to now, it's been mostly financial, it's been coordinated, it's been supported, and it's been kind of condoned by the government, but it's still not effectively run by the government, as far as I know. If you know anything new since...
They're trying to centralize more under the FSB, right? But
right.
It's a process.
Yeah, okay. So, and then there's, China or North Korea, where they actively have the effectively government agencies that are attackers, that are going out there for trying to get intelligence.
Fundraising.
And for China, it's also specifically to feed back to their country, so, to their businesses. Anyway, so we developed this country threat index. It's kind of a modifying factor on the overall framework. And then because we have a complex system with different levels of information, and even though what we're doing is a relatively simple version of the overall network, when we start expanding out, we've already started expanding out, it can get very complex very quickly. Regular statistics don't really work it. Bayesian networks allow you to kind of implement and integrate the more complexity. So we've introduced and used Bayesian network analysis, which other people are now starting to do, which is great. And then use that by just putting in some of the data in a small model system with different levels of harm versus not. So this is with in the first round, you've got coming in from a country that's known to be dangerous with a top-level database. Do you have a higher risk or a lower risk? Ran the calculations, and indeed, when you have a very high risk, there's higher risk to the database compromise, and the distribution of overall risk moves out towards higher risk. And when everything is lower risk and it's coming from a more secure country, in this case, the United States. Then the risk kind of moves towards this is not likely to be a high-risk situation. And that's pretty much a kind of layout of what this whole paper is about. So I'd love to have discussion, and I'd love to have feedback, and we have my modeler in the room who I think would love to have feedback as well.
That's great. That's really helpful. Yeah, and we can obviously get into the statistics, that analysis. We can talk more about governance. If people from their own research perspectives have different input they'd like to add to that.
And also great. Issues that you think need to be brought into the discussion would be helpful also, because we've got a pretty paltry discussion at this point.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I guess we should clarify too, so the final audience for this paper in particular,
we're thinking of computers and security as a journal.
Okay.
So this is way too big and too complex to put into one of the conferences.
Okay.
So we've presented this at a number of different places and pieces, and it's gotten more complex, and we just want to present it as a whole story, and that means a journal.
Oh, that's great. So we'll go ahead and start the queue. So Dean, if you want to kick us off, and then
I have a couple questions. One, it wasn't clear what the objective of these hackers, I don't know, security risk people were, and that might be important what they're trying to accomplish. And I'm thinking of are they trying to put the system down? They're trying to gather information, and simultaneously, I wasn't sure what the risk. There could be lots of risks, it seems, and it wasn't clear what you were focusing on. So, risk the data would be stolen, that the system just be shut down, so it would impact some. You could cripple a power, whatever it would be, cripple a power plant, or get a list of undercover agents, whatever it is. So those things were not clear to me. And maybe you could just discuss that.
Okay, so in terms of the actors, we set up a really simple model to start with. So this is just a secure database. So it's a theoretically top secret database that should only be accessed by people with the appropriate credentials and who are the appropriate people that have not stolen the credentials. And that's what we're trying to model, and we're just trying to model it predictively. So in terms of the actors, then we have the regular people that are supposed to access it, and then we have the people who are not supposed to access it, and are they gonna be prevented? You know, is the database gonna be compromised? In terms of what are the risks in this case are pretty much access to the database, and so and whether or not it's confidential, the confidentiality is compromised. So the traditional types of vulnerabilities considered for cybersecurity, as I think you probably know, are accessibility, the integrity of the data, and confidentiality. We have added time because when you deal with a task, when you deal with any sort of mission, there's often time windows involved in which things have to be added. This is definitely not the time question at this point. We have gone a step farther in an experiment that we're playing out in a test bed where we're looking at both accessibility to the database and compromise to the database. So we've got both of those pieces in there. We're still not looking at integrity at this time, and we've got some timing issues in there as well. But for this particular one, all we're talking about is compromise to the database, so it's just confidentiality.
And then
Federica's next.
yes, yep, absolutely, yep.
Yes, thank you. This is fascinating, and I have to admit that I am not sure that I can say that I understand everything in the paper. But the question of culture is really fascinating to me, and I wonder if you can say something more about the sort of like an analytical purchase of the concept of culture. I understand intuitively, perhaps, the need to add the human component in a model of cybersecurity risk. What is the culture adding to the human component that the human component is not capturing, particularly when, and I reiterate my ignorance, it seems to me that cyber attacks might be an activity that has very porous barriers to communication. Like whether I'm in Pakistan or in Iceland, it doesn't really matter. Particularly when it comes to modeling culture as location within a country. The question of culture becomes problematic to me to sort of like, what is culture giving you, but also what is culture qua location within a country giving you that the human component is not giving you?
So in terms of the human component itself, we try to model the attackers, the defenders, and ultimately we will try to add the users into it. So in terms of that, there's two types of culture that are most important because one thinks that defenders are going to be just technical, or one hopes that defenders are just going to be technical, and culture's not going to play a role in it too much. But both users and attackers have cultural components to them. It's not really being played out in this paper as much. We've just had a paper accepted to Frontiers in Psychology in which we're looking at maliciousness from a perspective of cybersecurity that addresses this cultural issue more. And there are different levels of culture that are really important. This is only one piece of the culture, though. This is very much just what can you get from the location of where this is coming from. So the national culture, and it's very much played out and based on Hofstede's dynamics and Hofstede's analysis that came from decades of analyzing IBM employee data questionnaires that he gave out over time. He was an HR person who kind of was a statistician at the same time, and so he just had these years of having these HR things that he sent out to IBM, and since it's a multicultural agency business around the world, he ended up being able to kind of characterize a large number, not all the cultures, not all the countries, but a large number of countries based on a number of different characteristics. He started with 4, and we're at about 6 now. And it just kind of gives you what we're hoping for is that it gives you a sense of kind of the approach that the different attackers are going to play. When it gets to users, it'll be also a matter of users. So are the users more likely to just follow rules, as an example, or are they the kind of people that would prefer to ignore rules and just go off and try anything on their own because it's an exploration culture that doesn't pay attention as much to the power dynamic and tends not to necessarily follow the rules that are laid down upon them. Obviously, the first one's more like China, the second one is more like the United States. Then there's other kinds of culture to the payroll. So there's culture that comes, so there's macroculture, mesoculture, and microculture. And below microculture, which is like individual to individual, which would be in the case of attackers, if you think about the early hackers. And the early hackers that were kind of trying to prove to each other that they were better, stronger, different, more adventurous than the next person, that would have been a microculture interaction. But even below that, there's the single individual culture, which is the personality. Are you insecure? Are you very secure? Are you dark triad type of person? That's the individual part of it. Microculture is the what plays out like among, as I said, among like the testosterone-ridden teenagers. Mesoculture tends to be group identified, so you can cross boundaries, you can cross national boundaries absolutely with mesoculture. And these days you can probably cross boundaries with the microculture too, would be my guess. And then macroculture tends to be, higher level, regional, national sort of situations. And they all have their different characteristics and they all have different ways of being analyzed, and not all of them have been pulled in at this point to cybersecurity, but we think that they would certainly play a role in attitude of attacker, possibly willingness to cross boundaries for attacker in terms of cross ethical boundaries, in terms of willingness to cross legal boundaries, are some of the bigger questions I think that we have. Also, what people consider ethics, what is the interpersonal ethics in one country versus another is very different, obviously, and therefore is likely to play a role in how people are willing to, how far people are willing to go on the internet as an attack type of person. And then from the user perspective, it's whether or not they take a chance. How many antivirus programs do you put on your computer versus the people that don't put on any because they don't need to. Some of the people that don't put on antivirus at all, by the way, are some of the defenders that I know, which I find to be very kindly amusing. They kind of go, well, I already know what's out there. It's like, great. I upgrade it all the time. I make sure that I always, upgrade everything all the time, but why should I have an antivirus when I know what I'm looking for? I'm not kidding, actually.
We all live in glass houses.
Well, yeah. So,
that brought up like a dozen ideas in my mind, so I want to get to you, Lee, but just really, really quick. So the focus is on macroculture, which you seem to be saying.
In this case, yes.
In this
because
case.
that's what the ARL asks us to do.
Totally. Yeah. And so what you're saying is certain types of macrocultures are more correlated with degrees of state sponsorship. Is that fair to say, of cyber attacks, or a larger role for the state?
Absolutely.
In coordinating these types of attacks, which could give rise to
Whoa, this is not the first
advanced
talk here that's talking about
Oh, sure.
that.
No, exactly. Okay. Which could give rise, I'm just trying to connect all the dots,
Yes.
to advanced persistent threats and these more sophisticated types of attacks that are more likely to breach these secure databases.
Yes.
Okay. And what Frederica was saying was maybe the mesoculture, which crosses kind of these state boundaries pretty easily, is another interesting way. It sounds like maybe you've done this already, but looking not at national cultures, but group cultures, since a lot of these groups, anonymous, whatever, don't really respect national boundaries very much. But that would be anher project.
We haven't had a chance to do any of that, so what we're working on right now in terms of a project, whatever, an experiment is more actually on the individual still.
Yes.
So we're working on a dark triad project.
That's really interesting. And then just really quick, then we'll get to Lee. From a policy perspective, then, is the goal here to push more countries toward, as far as an outcome, kind of this more U.S. model, for lack of a better term, and away from a more state-centric model, so that there would be fewer, of these advanced persistent threats? Does that kind of bring in internet governance to a certain extent, or is that too far afield?
Right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess what I'm seeing is that, just the news recently is that the U.S. government is moving away from terrorism per se.
Oh, sure.
And moving towards more understanding of specific actors, and one of the big areas that they're focusing on is cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And the two actors that they're focusing on is not surprisingly China and Russia.
No, we're back to great power.
Yeah.
No, but anyway, yeah. So sorry, Lee, please, would you like to jump in?
Yeah,
with your thought,
it's
or-
on
yeah.
the same line, so, this is hard work, obviously. So this view of culture, I think some of us in social sciences have difficulty with because it's so large. I mean, you know, she might eat pasta and someone might eat tacos, and that's culture too.
Right.
But your break, it was very helpful when you were starting to break it down. And I guess you have to use country metric measures, even though some of these things transcend borders, obviously. So when I think of the probability of someone attacking, it'd probably be driven by ideology, which is how you want the world to be as opposed to how the world is, in my view, how I think about ideology. I think about poverty, or income inequality. You mentioned ethics. I think that's very important, that this isn't wrong because the U.S. is rich and they're a bunch of capitalist thieves and it's fine to do this. So I applaud this, and it's hard to get these measures. But I think, so you're going about it probably in the right way. But I think these smaller details, which of it is it ideology, is it poverty, it could be all of these things. But then it'd be interesting when you model it and see which of these things matter more. So I guess there's two things. One is, what do we, in an ideal world, what would we like to measure? And then in the world that you live in, the world all of us do when we do empirical work, is how do we construct these measures? And should the unit be the country, the region, or not? And I guess you could play around and aggregate some of these things. And then just the other thing is, Scott just, no, be quiet. Scott's last point is, are we moving to, is the world moving to a U.S. model? I guess I would agree with what you said now. The biggest threat's probably China and Russia, but if we think about world trade, China didn't play by the rules 20 years ago, and now they are, for the most part, playing by the rules.
And writing it.
And being part of it. So it's an interesting, they're not perfect players, but I'm saying compared to where they were 20 years ago, they would never be part of the World Trade Organization. They wouldn't think about,
Okay, but let's pay attention to what China did however many years ago. They consciously said, where is the world going? And then they cornered markets. So they did that very explicitly for two things. One is solar energy, and the other is for computer hardware. So they literally went into Congo and to the other sources of the rare metals that are essential for computer chips, and they have 80% of the market. And similarly for solar, they're above 50. They're, I think, at 60 or 70 right now.
I'm not disagreeing with some of what they do, but again, compared to where they were, I think increasingly so, as they want to be known as a world player, it's more, so they've got their reputation as well as, are they this evil country? Or do they want to be seen as someone who can mediate, someone who can get involved for peace, someone who can,
I don't see them there yet. I see them
I don't
still
think
as
they are
very
there
strategic.
yet, but I'm just saying, it may be 20 years down the road. But I see at least certainly where they were in trade and piracy and so on, they're way less than they were years ago. Because now they're doing their own patent stuff. They're on some of these technological frontiers. You mentioned solar. They're on one of the technological frontiers.
Well, I don't see any difference in Russia or China in terms of access to pirated software and videos. I see equal access in both places. You go to a market, anything you want's there. It
Well,
costs.
more and more people are actually playing by the rules, and at least this is, someone gave a paper last term on this. They
Well,
are,
they're producing a
might
lot
be
more.
doing more by the rules, but when it comes down to the actual, when you go into the country and you go to a
Yeah.
market, a street market, you still see the hundreds and hundreds of,
yeah.
which one do you want? Oh, I don't have that, come back
Right,
tomorrow, I'll
right,
give it to you.
yeah.
Okay,
But
see
getting
that.
back to the main point, will you be able to then, I guess, get at what individual characteristics ultimately, again, is it poverty, is it ideology, is it ethics, is it of these components that you're lumping into culture matter? I guess that'd be the goal, right?
Okay, so from a social policy perspective, I think that is really fascinating. And it's something that I would like to do. And the piece of work that we're in the middle of doing for the maliciousness piece, for characterizing
Right.
attackers and people's attitude about attack type stuff, we are trying to reach out to as many countries as we can, to get partners in as many countries as we can,
Nice.
to fill out this maliciousness survey that has pieces that are dark triad oriented, and
I'm not sure if everybody knows that phrase.
so dark triad is Machiavellianism, which is kind of power hungry, narcissism, so self-focused rather than other people focused, and psychopathy, so the willingness to cross social boundaries, I guess would be a way to phrase it. And the three and the three together, by the way, characterize most politicians.
Oh, wow.
Relevant today.
Yeah, well, it's true. And relatively, yeah,
Yeah.
most politicians have some aspect of various pieces of the dark triad, if not all of them, including our current beloved leader. So,
It'd be a good miniseries title HBO as well, Dark Triad. I'd watch that. We also have partners at the Global Cybersecurity Index that we could talk about, the ITU, that have been surveying a lot of these countries as well. So afterward, let's
That
get
would be
together
great.
and we can
Yes,
make some
absolutely.
pathways. But
So,
Sorry.
but
Oh, yeah, we're
on this
finished.
other
Yeah.
piece with ARL, they are way more interested in the country side of it and these individual characteristics piece, so that they can try to identify bad actors per se. Whereas this other meso level and the social policy type of pieces, the Army's not interested. So, whereas me coming from SPIA, obviously that's something that is of great interest to me, coming from environmental justice and social justice, that's of great interest to me. And certainly whether or not that plays a role in people's willingness to do things. This whole thing about, it's funny because that one guy has been targeted as the Nigerian prince, and he's not Nigerian and he's not a prince, obviously, but nobody thought he was. But my cousin was in, I think it was Nigeria, and he was finding people who were doing exactly the same thing in Nigeria, in the camps. There, literally across the road from the entrance to the camp was a small internet cafe where there was a cluster of them there on a daily basis, sending out these letters, and this has got to be 10 plus years ago, where they would literally be trying to get money from people through effectively the same letters. And when he talked with them through an interpreter, their comment was, "We have no other access to money. This is it." And you kind of shrug and go, "That makes sense. I'm never going to give it to you, but that makes sense." And so this other guy theoretically started in like 2010, 2011, so he's not the original Nigerian prince. The original Nigerian princes are probably from Nigeria, because my cousin was there more than 2010 ago, and they were definitely there. And they were definitely people in the holding camps that had no place to go and weren't being allowed out and didn't have education and barely had any sanitation at all. So,
paints a different picture here.
yeah, it does.
I also, for the record, think the original Nigerian prince would be a great HBO special.
Wouldn't it? After Game of Thrones, we have their new lineup.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're watching HBO.
Alright, so I have a couple of questions. First, and I think actually you might have answered this may be a clarifying question, but your diagram, I think that is really helpful on like page 13, whatever. When we've been talking about culture, is that all of the stuff that's in like the yellow bubble under country? Is that what?
It's not all of it by any means, it's a very select piece of it.
Okay, I'm just not, does it correspond to one of the bubbles in there, or is it?
Okay, so let's
So
go.
you got type of
hold
attack,
on.
hierarchical organization, malicious saturation, total number of attacks.
Make sure I have it here. Did I do it? No, I didn't do it. Shoot.
It's income,
I
connection,
no, I have a trust. We have a trust hierarchy that I should be able to find, which I apparently closed. Let's see which one I had. No, that's not.
A lot of us can probably pull it up too. If we go to your paper, right?
Age at
Mhm.
2015. I should be able to. It's not in this paper.
Okay,
Oh, it's not this. I'm
No,
sorry.
no,
Oh,
no,
okay.
no, no. We have. I was going to pull it in here, and I
Trust.
apparently didn't.
It's this article back here.
okay. Okay, I guess I was just curious.
Yeah,
because-
yeah. So what we did originally was try to lay out all the different pieces that contribute to trust
Mhm.
that include aspects that go all the way from country to individual.
Mhm.
And so we've got a framework that turned into an ontology, which has barely been used as an ontology, more used as a framework to try to characterize it. And now we're supposed to be playing out some of the more environmental pieces, which are more of what I think Lee was talking about.
Okay, so it's not like a direct mapping of like culture is these three gray boxes in this diagram.
No, this is just one
Okay.
piece.
Just making sure that I.
This is just one small piece of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and so just again clarifying, does this mean that there's sort of a distribution of your sort of expected distribution of types of attacks? You then use that distribution as an input into this model. Is that
Yes.
okay? And the variation in that would be these sort of. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to make sure I was sort of understanding how this was working. Because this brings me to a larger question, which is, and this may or may not be helpful for sort of publishing in the journal it sounds like you want to publish in, but I'm wondering if there are other systems that work or look like this. So are there other systems, either in ecology or social network systems that, I mean, this is me being a little selfish because I don't have a lot of access points for understanding this particular network because I don't study computer science. I don't understand it very well, unfortunately. But I was just curious, both as a sort of framing of the model that you're doing, which you may not need to, but also from a reader's perspective, I was just curious, like, are there other frameworks that are similar to this, or that you are drawing on, or that could draw on your framework in terms of the way they are thinking about predictive outcomes in complex network systems?
All right. So where this all came from, when it decides to repopulate this way, we started with the Presidential Congressional Commission on Environmental Risk Management, which gave a cycle of risk assessment to risk management that starts you with kind of assessing the system, understanding the system as a complex system that's dynamic, that is not simple, that you have to start by simplifying and then you add more complexity to it. And then you cycle around, you assess it, you figure out what's wrong, you protect, and then you reassess the system. We took that and we moved it into the cybersecurity system and kind of adapted it to the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Standards and whatever T is.
Yeah, you got
Framework for risk, and kind of remodified it, integrated all the pieces, so we have identify the pieces, detect where the problems are, respond, and then have the system recover are kind of most of the pieces of it, and which also overlaid on a very standard approach, a cycle by this guy. Oh God, now I'm blanking on his name. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. Who was an Air Force pilot in like the 50s or something like that, and 60s, and he developed what's called the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. so it doesn't have the, and then observe would be the next step back again. So again, it's a constant recycling. And it was his way of saying, this is the way to work in any military situation. You constantly must be observing, you must figure out what's going on and orient yourself to the changes in the system and what's happening in the system, the active pieces of it, decide what has to happen and then act, and then come back again. And they all kind of mesh in the exact same way. And so this whole process actually overlays upon the environmental process. In terms of parameterization, we developed the parameters and the whole, there's this huge framework of literally all parts of cybersecurity networks that we could come up with. It's got software, it's got hardware, it's got cloud, it's got the people in it. And when you lay it out with all the different pieces in just our preliminary layout, we had, it's like 3 feet deep by 3 walls long in a room that, so it would probably be like 1 wall and a half in this room or something. It was pretty big. We haven't put it anywhere at this point other than on files because we have to get, it probably would end up going in this paper like as a appendix afterwards. But that was all based on literally understanding and doing parameterization in environmental systems. And understanding that all you're dealing with is the same situations. You've got components, the components have different levels of organization within them, so you understand that you have a community, the community is made up of individuals, community is made up of populations, the population is made up of individuals, the individuals have organs, the organs respond to different kinds of stressors in different ways, the sub-organs respond to different stressors in different ways, it's manifest all the way up and you can measure it and assess at different levels. And effectively what we were trying to do is you've got a computer system is essentially the same thing. A computer network is effectively a population interacting. Or a community because it's different kinds of populations interacting. So we have been paralleling it the whole time. We are continuing to do ecological risk and environmental risk issues, and we just have the 2 parallel projects going. So we think just kind of that any complex system can be analyzed the same way.
Okay, so that leads to my final question, which is your hypothesis is, we hypothesize that risk in cyber systems can be dynamically assessed with each change in state of the system. Is that true of the environmental system as well? Is that sort of true across the board? And if so,
It can, but what happens
as a hypothesis?
Yes, but what happens in environmental systems is environmental systems tend to go towards a new equilibrium before people are able to assess it, because logistically it's very hard to assess as you change. Whereas in cyber systems can be monitored and are being monitored on an infinitesimally smaller time point. I mean, your detection sensors that are in systems right now, your virus programs and stuff like that, are detecting packets as they go by. So you're talking about hundredths of seconds or milliseconds, so thousands of seconds, compared to in, ecological systems. It takes you, a day to collect a whole bunch of data. By that time, a whole lot's changed. You don't have time to go back and recollect every single day. So maybe you do it once every 3 years or something. Completely different time frame. And by that time, in that kind of frame, you definitely have a new equilibrium happening in cyber systems. There's no such equilibrium happening because there's always a new system coming in. And as we rely more and more on cyber systems, there are fewer and fewer cyber systems that could ever get to an equilibrium.
It seems like some of that stuff would be great in your discussion points, like thinking about how, depending on how broad you want to go with this, but how it compares to the other systems you've looked at and what kinds of, how it differs and what the system is telling us as a result. Like that would be really cool in group discussions.
And for what it's worth, there's some interesting work on ecosystem-based management applied to Internet of Things issues that's been coming out. So everyone remembers we have a cool program on Friday on sustainable development in cybersecurity, so which is all going to be about, for example, environmental law principles applied to cybersecurity and vice versa. We have folks flying in all the way from Canberra for this, so it's going to be fun. Actually, just this morning we heard there's 140 registrants already, so they have an overflow classroom. That's going to be really neat.
They have one classroom for this?
They have 2. Well, it's an SGIS auditorium, and then there's an overflow classroom on top of that. So get there early and RSVP for lunch if you'd like to go. But Lee, did you have an interjection before we?
No, just
okay, yeah, just getting the cue.
Question.
Yeah.
Just back to you.
No, that's perfect. Yeah. Sorry.
That was great.
Your recent answer just has informed this question a little bit, so feel free to skip it if you want. But I'm wondering, what is the virtue of having different required risk level, required access levels? But because this is a dynamic system, it does kind of make sense that maybe you don't want to always default to a high required access level because of that dynasty.
Well,
And then the other question that I had might be more interesting, I was wondering if you could maybe talk about a James Bond type of villain, the type of person who is sophisticated, well-resourced, who realizes that if I do this from China, my chances of access are low because of this country risk threat. But if I move to Haiti, it might be a little bit easier. So I'm wondering a little bit more about either actors, rational actors, responding to the process itself, or any sort of adaptation in the process.
okay,
using proxies.
so I'm going to do the latter one first, just because it's so easy and so much fun. But that's the assumption, and that's one of the reasons why you just assume that if something has come from China, there's a possibility, but you also assume that they might have covered themselves up. And so there are ways of tracking back, and it just takes time. And so when I've talked to the people here in UITS about this, they say, it could take one person a few days or a week or so just to track back a single one, so you want to be selective about which ones you track back. And so what they would do is they would only be tracking back if they find that there's some sort of indicator that says this is worth your time to take the time to go back and try to track where this is really coming from. And that's one of the problems with advanced persistent threats, is that they know enough to cover their tracks and change what they look like and come in as Harvey, as an example. For people that don't know, Harvey's a imaginary pink rabbit who's 6 feet tall.
Not some crazy cybersecurity term or acronym.
But in terms of the first one, so just on this campus, just think about the fact that we have personal identifying information that is required to be protected by HIPAA among other regulations. So those are the equivalent of top secret. The military would say that that's not top secret enough, but invariably in the cyber exercises that I watch, the PII databases are always considered to be the most protected databases that they go after. So there's that, but then you also want to be able to look up somebody's name and email address if you want to try to reach them on campus. And then there's various levels in between. Any single network system of a complex entity automatically has different levels of security built into different parts of their database. So that's, everywhere has it. It's not just the military that would have it. So
So as a
it's kind of a default.
so-
Yes, of course you have to pay
So
attention.
I understand that they put security around the information, or do they put security? Do they dictate the security level to the threat?
No, they dictate the security level to the entity itself. So here's one thing that's kind of amusing. So satellites theoretically have a whole lot of information on them, and it transmits at this point anything from business and what you're video streaming, all the way to the most important top secret information about where the different troops are going to be going and things that people's lives depend upon. At this point, the Army's approach is to put up more firewalls. So if the satellite is considered to be important and have real secret information, they might put up 7 layers of firewalls around it, maybe with different settings. And my attitude towards that is, if somebody can get through a firewall, they can get through 7 firewalls. What's the difference here? And I haven't heard anything different other than they say that, well, it's on a completely different separated network, and it's like, yeah, okay, but it's still only got firewalls. But they do it by the level of security that they think is important, and by that they mean they put on different levels of security, but it's still just firewalls and some sort of detection mechanism with some equivalent of antivirus.
Those
Or
systems are perfectly
anti-malware.
secure, yeah.
Yeah.
Even if you air gap, if you unplug from the public internet, there's still obviously ways in. Stuxnet's a great case in point.
My favorite is the USB that they threw in the parking lot.
Yes.
In Walter Reed, if I'm not mistaken, and somebody went in and picked it up out of the parking lot, stuck it into their computer, and whoever it was had complete access to the whole network.
Biggest breach in U.S. Central Command's history.
Yeah.
So don't pick up
Must
those
be
free
a
flash
small
drives.
things, man.
We talked
It's
about-
all out the pocket.
We talked
How
about
does
getting like
a
little.
15-year-old from Britain, a 15-year-old from Britain, mock, somehow or other get Brennan's information, for example. I mean, it was just like,
It's pretty crazy, isn't it?
it was.
Yeah.
Did you read that?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's-
We talked about getting little mock-ups as giveaways at these tables that we have for the cybersecurity program, and then if you plugged in the flash drive, it said, if you plug this in, you need to apply here to the cybersecurity risk. So sorry, Lee. Yeah.
Yeah, this is, I guess, ultimately, you want some policy recommendations, potentially, and there's benefits and costs.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it enlightening to be hearing people's thoughts, because some of these things are not amenable, it seems, to policy very well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you've got this triad of
Mhm.
narcissistic, psychopathic, whatever folks,
Yeah.
I don't know what you can do for that, really, except try to contain it in the ways that you're talking about.
Mhm.
Other things, like you mentioned these guys in Nigeria, well, that's a poverty issue.
Mm-hmm.
So that, those things, so that's why I'm saying some of these things may be more amenable. First, you want to see what are the risk factors, but some of them may be more amenable to some kinds of policies
Mm-hmm.
than others. Is that where this is ultimately headed? Or?
That would be nice to be able to have that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
I'm sure that this is part of where the Army wants us to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
normally in economics, we talk about benefit-cost ratios. So where should you put your money? So you want to put some of your money, obviously, into protecting.
Mm-hmm.
But then this is Bayesian, so people are learning on both sides, right? And then there's, how much does it, what are the benefits and what are the costs, and where should you put your bucks? So I guess this is where this is ultimately getting us, right? By your building the model and parameterizing it and giving us estimates, is saying, well, this is our highest risk, and therefore, on a benefit-cost ratio, this is what we should be targeting. Is that a way to think about it?
I think that's a really good perspective, especially for the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was just trying to figure if I got it in my head, so.
Yeah.
And just to build directly on Lee's point, that was my last point as well. So two kind of policy perspectives that I could see coming from this, one national and one international. On the national one, you mentioned the NIST, cybersecurity framework on page 3, and the fact that it's quite static. It doesn't include, human factors, some of these other issues that you brought up very well.
Yeah.
And I was just wanted to mention, they're taking comments right now to the next version of the NIST cybersecurity framework. So I thought, one takeaway could be, based on this research and your other related work, how would you like to see the framework updated to better reflect, these findings? So nationally, that's one. Internationally, my mind goes back to our. Did you guys see in the New Yorker Making China Great Again? Like maybe 2-3 weeks ago, that came out. Great article, and they actually explicitly reference China's cyber sovereignty position. So this idea of pushing more and more countries to have a bigger role for the state in internet governance. And as the U.S. withdraws from a lot of these multilateral fora, we're leaving the field open for those kind of discussions. We're not participating in them. So it seems to me that another takeaway for as far as international policy goes, if you wanted to go down that road, is the need for the U.S. to stay present in cyber norms discussions about what we want internet governance to look like, and whether we want to keep the multi-stakeholder status quo or move toward this multilateral state-on-state model that China would prefer. So anyway.
That's a good point.
That's good.
I know we're running out of time, but did anybody else have final comments or questions? Or I'm not sure. Oh yeah, please feel free, Barb. Yeah.
Just kind of an observation, because I'm trying to figure out how this would. For me, it would have been helpful to have some sense of almost like a kind of topology of forms of failures that you try and protect against, because there's different ways that systems fail. And until you understand how they fail, you don't know how to fix them. So one that came to mind that influenced me early on years ago was the Challenger disaster. In understanding why it blew up, and really traced it back. And what they found with the Challenger disaster, the most significant thing was culture. It had to do with the culture of making launch decisions, who was tending to make the decisions, competing cultures of engineers versus the funding, and the people who were pushing to not defer the launch schedule won out over the safety people with the engineers, including the fact that they had no data to show what would happen to those O-rings at that temperature.
Right.
And so when they studied the Challenger disaster, they also found with the later one, what was the name of the other shuttle that, okay, they found there were other issues. There were some of the systemic problems of the Challenger that were not solved yet and helped contribute to the Columbia. So if you want to do a risk assessment, and because complex systems, you can't reduce them into component parts to understand their behavior. Their behavior is emergent, they're irreducible. You actually need a mechanism by which to get a handle on the kind of systems failure and how you come back and use that in itself to inform the model you're trying to develop. Because the model itself is only reflecting what you know at the time. So, and the equivalent of like black swans again, you know, when you have a black swan, how do you, the whole point was you couldn't predict it, but when something happens that you couldn't contemplate, then how do we take that and use that to better inform, inform? So, I guess my general observation is that this is what's so challenging with complex systems. So again, I found that if there was some, because this isn't my area per se, and maybe it's implied with some of the readers, but actually having some kind of topology of forms of system failures. So that you can also then describe why your model or your way of your dealing might better help you address that, or what do you need to help better inform your model over time based on what you learn. So it's just some thoughts.
It's interesting you mentioned Columbia as well. So we just did a draft article on the case for a National Cybersecurity Safety Board modeled after the NTSP, and we did a write-up on Columbia. So I can send you a draft of that if you do want to take some of Barb's suggestions.
If
I
you
think
know
are
the work
great.
of Diane Vaughn,
On point.
No.
Diane Vaughn wrote a book about what happened with Challenger, and it's using a
Interesting.
complex systems perspective, but very much a sociological perspective to help us understand what actually happened here. And it was, again, more the human factor. It had to do with how humans were making decisions. And the different cultures and how you had a business culture, you had a FICOL, the engineers, they had conflicting cultures, and there was a certain form of information that kept getting censored to certain people making decisions, and they didn't get integrated in a way that would have better enabled the safety issue to come to the fore. So it just seems to me it's an example of a story of a microcosm, what it seemed to me you were trying to accomplish, because it was almost all humans
So
that were really led to why that particular accident happened.
So one of the other problems is then communication, and the reason why social engineering works is because lack of communication, because people take somebody at their word and don't bother to go back and say, is this person who they're claiming to be, which is usually just a phone call.
But unfortunately, we're out of time. But Diane, did you have any
that's
final any thoughts? Or?
No, thank you very much. That's been really fascinating and really helpful.
No, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you all again, and hopefully we'll see you on Friday if you want to like to.